For the uncomplicated woman whose membranes have ruptured at term, starting labor promptly lowers the risk of infection for her and for her baby, and it does not cost her a cesarean. That is the whole of this decision, and almost everything that makes it feel harder than it is comes from two places: comparing induction against the wrong alternative, and trusting numbers that are quietly measuring which women got induced, rather than what induction did to them. So this lecture is about earning that one sentence honestly.
Start with the word we lean on when we decide to wait: expectant management. It sounds like the gentle option, the one where nature is left to take its course and the woman goes into labor on her own and has a clean birth. That is not what it is. Expectant management is the labor clock and the delivery clock both left running, with the infection clock climbing underneath them the whole time. The 4 clocks we separated at the start of this course, none of them paused just because we chose to wait. And left to run, those clocks do not deliver everyone into a tidy, spontaneous birth. By a day, only about 2 in 3 women are even in labor. The other third are still waiting. Fewer than half have actually delivered by a day. And a real slice of the women we manage expectantly cross over into induction anyway, later with more hours on the ruptured membranes behind them. In the largest trial we have, the single most common reason an expectantly managed woman ended up induced was that she asked to be. So waiting is not a neutral default the way it feels at the bedside. It is an active exposure with its own distribution of outcomes. And that distribution, the soon laboring, the late laboring, and the eventually induced all together, is the thing induction has to be measured against.
Which brings us straight to the fear that shadows every induction: that if you ripen a cervix that wasn't ready, you have bought yourself a cesarean. That fear comes from a specific comparison, and the comparison is the mistake. If you line up the woman you induced this week against the woman who happened to go into labor on her own this week, induction looks bad. The crude risk of cesarean runs as much as half again higher. But look at who those 2 women are. The woman laboring spontaneously was, by definition, ready. Her body chose the moment. The woman you don't induce isn't her. The woman you don't induce enters expectant management. And the honest way to score induction is against everyone in that expectant group. The ones who labor spontaneously this week, and everyone who delivers in the weeks after, by whatever route it turns out to be: spontaneous or induced, vaginal or cesarean. When you balance the 2 groups properly and compare induction to that whole future, the cesarean signal collapses. Before 40 weeks, inducing does not raise the cesarean rate, and if anything, it lowers it. The objection that an unripe cervix genuinely fails more often is true. Those failures are real. But they are being counted against a comparator that also fills up with cesareans: the expectant group's own later arrests, its own fetal distress sections, its own inductions down the line. The scar that induction seems to cause is largely the scar the underlying pregnancy was going to cause anyway.
And the cleanest proof is the one trial that removed the sorting entirely. When women were randomly assigned to elective induction, rather than induced because someone was worried, the cesarean penalty simply wasn't there. In the term rupture trials pooled together, cesarean is flat, a risk ratio of about 0.84, with a confidence interval that sits right across no difference. In the biggest single trial, the cesarean rates were 10.1% with immediate oxytocin and 9.7% with expectant management, essentially identical. The whole engine underneath this is one idea worth holding on to, because it comes back before the lecture is done. In the real world, treatment is assigned by worry, not by chance. Sicker pregnancies get induced, and sicker pregnancies get sectioned, so induction inherits a cesarean rate it did not create.
With the cesarean fear set aside, we can ask what prompt induction actually buys. And the answer that earns the whole decision is maternal. Starting labor early roughly halves a woman's risk of infection in and around the uterus, chorioamnionitis while she is still pregnant, endometritis afterward. The relative risk sits near 0.49. And this one you can feel the mechanism of directly, because it is just the fourth clock made concrete. Rupture removes the seal between the vagina and the uterus. Ordinary vaginal organisms begin working their way upward, and the longer the membranes stay open, the more of that ascent happens. Shortening the interval to birth is, quite literally, subtracting exposure hours. The largest trial shows the arithmetic plainly. Chorioamnionitis fell from about 1 in 12 women down to about 1 in 25, 4% against 8.6%, while the time from rupture to delivery was nearly halved, from a median of 33 hours down to 17. To prevent one maternal infection, you need to induce roughly 9 women, which is a genuinely strong number for an obstetric intervention.
Now, the honest caveat has to travel with that number, because the evidence underneath it is not pristine. These are mostly older trials, many of them only quasi-randomized, almost none of them blinded. And the chorioamnionitis they counted was defined loosely, sometimes at a temperature threshold lower than we would use today. So why lean on it at all? Because the effect is large. It repeats across trial after trial, and it is exactly what the ascending infection biology predicts. A big, mechanistically expected signal survives sloppy measurement far better than a small, surprising one would. And if you distrust the soft chorioamnionitis label specifically, the harder maternal endpoints move the same way. Less fever, fewer antibiotics before delivery, less postpartum sepsis. The interval effect does not depend on where you draw the line for the diagnosis. Fewer hours of open membranes means less bacterial ascent, whatever you choose to call the result.
The baby benefits too. But here, honesty means teaching the effect at its true, more modest size, rather than inflating it to match the maternal one. Early onset neonatal sepsis falls by roughly a quarter, a risk ratio around 0.73. It is smaller than the maternal effect for a reason worth understanding. The term newborn is better defended than we sometimes fear. Culture-proven sepsis is genuinely rare, and so the counts are small, and the definitions wobble. The strictest definite sepsis endpoint rests on very low-quality evidence. The same rising bacterial load is doing the exposing, but the endpoint is rarer, and the baby's defenses are more mature at term. So the same waiting hours translate into fewer crossings into real invasive disease. You might reasonably ask how the pooled trials show a neonatal benefit at all when the single biggest trial found neonatal infection essentially equal, around 2 to 3% either way. The answer is that that trial allowed up to 4 days of expectant waiting and counted infection by broad criteria. Pool many trials together, most of them inducing earlier and more decisively, and the modest true reduction surfaces. And it sharpens the moment you act early rather than merely eventually. In the trials that induced within 12 hours, neonatal sepsis fell from about 11.8% to 6.1%, and admissions to intensive care were close to halved. Earlier is where the neonatal benefit lives.
That last point is really about the shape of the risk over time, and the shape is the thing to carry out of this lecture. The infection risk driving all of these numbers rises smoothly from the very hour of rupture. There is no hour at which it switches on. When you pool the timing studies, 15 of them, more than 70,000 mother and baby pairs, the odds of neonatal infection roughly double with every 12 hours the membranes stay open, a near straight line on the log scale. Do not memorize the individual odds ratios along that line. They mix term and preterm pregnancies and they scatter. Memorize the doubling, the steady upward slope. That slope is exactly why prompt has to mean promptly and not by some particular clock rating. The benefit of inducing is concentrated in the earliest hours, where you are cutting the curve off before it has climbed, and it fades the longer you wait. Which finally puts 24 hours in its place. 24 hours is not the moment danger arrives. It is a convergence, the point where several separate pressures happen to meet. Most women are already in labor by then. The work of monitoring has mounted. The infection curve has been climbing all along,
and it is the interval the trials and protocols settled on. It is a decision line laid over a smooth curve, not an edge the biology respects. And now the part that has to be met head-on rather than buried, because if you go looking in the data, you will find a real signal that immediate induction looks worse, and a resident who finds it and can't explain it will start hedging on prompt induction for the wrong reason. In one large term rupture cohort, the women induced in the first 6 hours had more fever in labor than the women induced later, and their newborns had slightly higher inflammatory markers. Read that at face value, and it says, don't induce too early. Read it honestly, and it says the opposite. That unit's protocol was to induce immediately when a woman already had infection markers up. So the earliest induced women were precisely the ones already brewing an infection when they walked in. The early group was enriched for sick women from the start. The induction did not make them sick. Their sickness is what got them induced early. And you can see the very same fingerprint on that cohort's cesarean numbers. Induced women were sectioned nearly twice as often as spontaneous laborers, 18% against under 10. And yet, when you compared the induction timing groups against each other, early against late, the cesarean rate was flat. The gap was never about when labor was induced. It was about which women needed inducing. This is the same machinery from the cesarean discussion returned in a new costume. Treatment assigned by worry, not by chance, which tells you how to hold the two kinds of evidence together.
The causal answer, does inducing help, lives in the randomized and pooled trials, where allocation is by chance and the sorting is broken. The observational timing cohorts are for the shape of the curve, and they carry this confounding by indication baked in. So when a cohort tells you early induction looks bad, suspect the sorting before you suspect the treatment. The cohort is not worthless. Its own honest conclusion is that waiting to 24 hours is safe in a woman with no early signs of infection, which is exactly the uncomplicated woman the trials describe. It only misleads if you forget who got sorted into its earliest hours. So for the uncomplicated woman, whose branch is already clear, cephalic, reassuring, no meconium, no bleeding, no scar, offer induction promptly and measure that offer against the real alternative, which is more waiting, not a guaranteed clean birth. Against that alternative, a prompt start lowers her risk of infection and her baby's, and it does not buy her a cesarean. And when a number seems to tell you otherwise, ask it the one question that settles most of them. Are you telling me what induction did, or only which women got induced?